So we're in lesson 20 tonight, ladies and gentlemen, looking at the first 13 verses of Mark chapter 9. So, second half of the book. It's kind of fun. Most of this, as you're probably well aware, is going to deal with the transfiguration, but we have this first verse in chapter 9 that apparently has generated way more conversation and, may I even say, controversy than it may at first indicate. So let me read that, and then we'll go on with it, because I like to hear what you guys might have read or heard or whatever about this verse. It says, "And Jesus said to them, Surely I say to you, there are some standing here who will not taste death till they see the kingdom of God present with power." And just a quick survey through my resources. There's at least 7 or 8 viewpoints on this statement by Jesus. I'm just going to give you kind of the broad strokes, and then we can dig a little bit deeper here. Essentially, this idea of taste death has the sense of violent death. And so there's that kind of laying behind it. But I guess maybe the predominant view is that what Jesus is talking about here is going to be, at least as far as the text is concerned, immediately fulfilled in the transfiguration that occurs right after this. Others have said that it either was much later, such as at his resurrection, or perhaps even at the fall of Jerusalem. And others have taken it much further out, as in Jesus' second coming. And there's a lot of debate about it, because then it gets into, well, who are some and what is taste death? And they just really ring the words here for all that they're worth. But what have you guys heard or read, or what are your thoughts on that before I delve into this any further?
Well, I've heard most of those, but I've always leaned towards the first one, that it's to do with the transfiguration, primarily having to do with this portion of Mark being the hinge of the whole arc of Mark's narrative.
Yeah.
The transition from, okay, the kingdom is coming, time to repent, the kingdom is coming, to, okay, no, we're faced towards Jerusalem, it's about the crucifixion now. And
Right.
having just announced that, basically he just shot down his disciples' entire hopes and dreams. And the kingdom is coming, and we're part of the entourage. This is great. To, oh no, I'm going to die, he had just said. And they're like, what? That doesn't work. That's not how this goes. That's not what the prophecy says. And he says, well, actually, it's fine, but you need to look at these parts. But don't worry, I'm going to give you a little bit here.
Yeah, and by the way, you touch on that, the proximity of the transfiguration to the statement. We see the same thing in Matthew and Luke. So kind of points to a preponderance, but you make a very solid point about the fact that, I forget exactly how you said it, but basically you just trod on all their messianic aspirations and what have you, and brought that in. And so now this is kind of the counterbalance to that. Other thoughts? Yay, nay?
I didn't see that. What I saw in that passage is that Jesus is telling them that after his death, the Pentecost would happen, and there would be God present with the body of believers with power. So I was kind of thinking that he was talking about after the resurrection and Pentecost.
Yep, and that's been a position that's been posited as well, that it was talking about Pentecost. You know, it really gets down to, and as I say, they kind of wring the heck out of the wording here, and there's this struggle with this idea of some will not taste death. And interpreters have said, so I guess that means some will have tasted death. And so they start to factor that into it, and they say, well, when did people start dying for their faith? And so the counterbalance to that is by the time we got to Pentecost, we hadn't seen people starting to be martyred yet. And so, but then the question is, well, just because it says some won't, doesn't mean necessarily that some will. And so you get into this whole linguistic jousting match that goes on with this. And I don't know that by Jesus saying that, well, some won't die before they see this happen necessarily means that some will die. And so to your point, Paula, I don't think that those who interpret this as being something like the resurrection or the Pentecost can necessarily be dismissed out of hand. I personally have, until I started studying it, I didn't really see it as anything else but the transfiguration. And just because of its proximity to the statement, I felt like it was almost like they were just saying, this is going to happen, now here it is. And certainly, as we get into the transfiguration, you know, this is not the final chapter, obviously. It's just a glimpse of that power. So, Paula, if you settle in on that idea of the Pentecost, you were in good company with a number of different scholars as well. So, it's why there's a lot of discussion about this statement that Jesus makes.
You know, previously in chapter 8, he spent an awful lot of time talking about his suffering, his death. And I think that that's another reason why I think that he was referring to something positive that would be happening soon in the resurrection and Pentecost.
Sure. Of course, the most immediate positive thing is he was going to knock their socks off here pretty quick on this mountain. So, but yeah, there's definitely that balance against that whole thing. And looking ahead a little bit, it's going to lead to some of the questions they have in the aftermath of the transfiguration, because we just kind of short-circuited them a little bit to see the one and then the other. Other thoughts?
So it's fun to hear you mention the concept of the semantics here, because this is one of the places that births the legend / myth of the wandering Jew. Because if it goes beyond, even Pentecost goes beyond the sacking of the burning of the temple, and then takes you to the end times, there's someone who's accursed because of the prophecy that Jesus kind of predicts. He's a part of the sum, and the culmination isn't until he comes again. And so this is one of the birthplaces of that wandering Jew concept.
Yep. Everybody kind of on board with that?
I mean, I don't believe in that legend, but
Well, that's why it's a legend. There's no Pecos Bill. John Henry didn't necessarily beat the steam engine, but
right.
It's like the golem. It's one of those things that's a part of the culture. This is kind of one of the birthplaces of it.
Yep. And don't be messing with John Henry now. Come on.
I like John Henry.
And then you got to get into Paul Bunyan and
Look, Babe the Blue Ox. I'm right there. I love that.
Well, I'll say in defense of the transfiguration being the fulfillment here, like what he's referencing, It's not just a standalone series of suddenly he tells them that he's going to die and be resurrected in 3 days, and they have no idea what he means. That shoots down their messianic ideas. He specifically says, "See the kingdom of God coming with power." There's a reference to a lot of prophecy. One of the big ones that gets highlighted is from Daniel chapter 7, where it talks very, very particularly about, "I saw one like the Son of Man coming with the clouds of heaven." He approached the Ancient of Days and was led into his presence and was given dominion, glory, and kingship, that the people of every nation and language should serve him. So, almost word for word, he's saying, look, this is about to happen. You're going to see a prophecy, what it's going to look like, even if it's a sample and not the actual event. Some of you, because he's in a small group discussion here, some of you standing here are going to get this. Not all of you, and indeed the story plays out that not all of them got it, just the 3 chosen. But there's a particular tie-in that has a lot longer standing than just Jesus suddenly changed his mind about the entire thing and decided to give up.
You know, you mentioned that, Trent, and it's just an amazing thing to me how many biblical scholars do not imbue Jesus with divinity, and that, you know, will make statements like, well, Jesus anticipated this or that or the other thing, and he was wrong, and it didn't come to pass. It's an amazing thing to me, how many respected and legitimate scholars overly humanize Jesus. I guess I'll say it that way.
Yeah.
I try not to just ignore them out of hand, but when they start from that perspective, it's kind of hard not to just throw them out. Sometimes I'll hang on to their linguistic studies, but I have to let the rest go.
Yeah.
Yeah. Let's step into this transfiguration that I spelled wrong in the notes. Okay. Transfiguration. Sounds like Elmer Fudd. The transfiguration. I didn't proofread that so well. Sorry about that. Verses 2-8. Let me read these. Now, after 6 days, Jesus took Peter, James, and John and led them up on a high mountain apart by themselves, and he was transfigured before them. His clothes became shining, exceedingly white like snow, such as no launderer on earth can whiten them. And Elijah appeared to them with Moses, and they were talking with Jesus. And Peter answered and said to Jesus, Rabbi, it is good for us to be here, and let us make 3 tabernacles, one for you, one for Moses, and one for Elijah, because he did not know what to say, for they were greatly afraid. Oh, that's verse 6 just makes me smile, right? Because I think, how many times do I just open mouth because I don't know what to say? And a cloud came and overshadowed them, and a voice came out of the cloud saying, This is my beloved Son, hear him. Suddenly, when they had looked around, they saw no one anymore, but only Jesus with themselves. I'll stop there. So, the inner circle, Peter, James, and John are up on the mountain with Jesus, are up on the tall mountain. And, there's been a lot of discussion about which mountain, and Mount Tabor and Mount Hermon are considered probably the 2 best. Hermon is much higher and it's closer to Caesarea Philippi, but it's like 9,000 feet. And it's been discussed about the fact, well, it seems like they stayed overnight there, so it might have been a bit chilly, but it doesn't really matter. Just neat things to think about. I'm just reading down through my notes here. Transfigured, that's where the noun version of that is where we get our word metamorphosis from. So there is an entire change here. This is not just an appearance. There's a radical transformation that goes on with Jesus. I know we talked about this a couple of weeks ago, and I've talked to you, Preston, about these guys in some other settings, but I think popularly, as you look through all the commentary, you see that Moses and Elijah are often thought to represent the law and the prophets. Certainly Moses as well, and I don't think this is in my questions. Moses as well is seen as a type of Jesus, and we'll look at Deuteronomy and what he says about that at the same time. And it's also been said that they both were associated with the wilderness. They had that going on, and they both had interesting ends to their appearances on earth and a whole lot of different things. Peter blurts out that they need to build 3 tents, which has led some commentators to think that this took place around the time of the Feast of the Tabernacles, but that doesn't really bear into this. And I think more tend to think that he was thinking about this in a much different way, which we'll discuss. And then this voice from the cloud, ostensibly God's voice, speaking from the cloud, commands them. And my New King James says here, but I don't think it's unusual because I've said this so many times. In the Bible, there's not a dichotomy between hearing and listening. When you're hearing, you are listening. Active hearing, active listening. So, and just kind of something that's not in the notes, but I just want to touch on it, is this was for, it's generally agreed that this was for these men. This is for them. It's to them. It's for them to understand. It's not something Jesus had to do for himself. It wasn't something that was just for him. It was for them. And Trent, you were hitting on this earlier as dealing with what he was sharing with them about the truth of his death and resurrection, as well as what they are anticipating. And we should never lose track of the fact, because there's a lot of discussion about, is this just a misplaced, hear what I'm saying now, because there's a lot of people that say this, that this is simply a misplaced resurrection narrative. Okay, I don't see that here at all, but that's been posited by a lot of people over the years. There's a lot of reasons to not believe that, not the least of which that we never see Elijah and Moses showing up anywhere else in the resurrection, and typically Jesus appears; he's not already there. So there's a lot of reasons to not believe that. But I think for me, all I have to do is look at 2 Peter, verse 1, chapter 1. It says in verses 16 through 18, he says, "For we did not follow cunningly devised fables when we made known to you the power and coming of our Lord Jesus Christ, for we're eyewitnesses of his glory, of his majesty. For he received from God the Father honor and glory when such a voice came to him from the excellent glory. This is my beloved Son, in whom I am well pleased. And we heard this voice which came from heaven when we were with him on the holy mountain." Which that in of itself lends a lot of credence to the idea that's what Jesus was talking about with his power. But this, which is recounted in Matthew, Mark, and Luke. And you look at things like Mark says, after 6 days, it's a very definitive time that we never see in Mark apart from the crucifixion narratives, that this is an actual historical event that they witnessed themselves. And so I don't want to overstate the importance of that, other than the fact that we should believe the Bible at its word. But it seems like there's so many out there trying to deconstruct.
Pastor, would you read that First Peter, was that?
Second
that scripture that you read?
2 Peter, chapter 1. 2 Peter chapter 1, verses 16 through 18.
Thank you.
You're welcome. I've always been enamored of Peter's first phrase in that verse where he says, we did not follow cunningly devised fables. That's a really strong apologetic statement that he makes there. So, I'm going to ask my question. I got to feel this kind of go different places, and that's totally cool. But what does the change in appearance of Jesus, what does this represent?
Shekinah glory of God.
That's a good phrase. I've read that a few times. Yes, I think there's a point to that. Let's take that a little bit deeper. You okay? Oh, thank you. I got plane back. Thank you.
Well, it's comparable to other appearances later, to Paul on the Damascus Road, and then in Revelation where John sees him, and again, all he can do is fall on his face. But it's a very, very similar image of, radiant light and white robes and everything.
Yeah.
I think Mark's description is, and I apologize if this offends, it's so homespun in its simplicity, but it really gets there, doesn't it? For somebody reading it, that he says it was like snow, such as no launderer on earth can whiten them. So, it speaks. Paul started out talking about the Shekinah glory. I mean, it's a white that we can't comprehend, and that's where Trent's heading with that, right? I mean, it's just these appearances are just otherworldly. Never seen anything like this.
Matthew adds on that his face shone like the sun.
Yeah.
But not only his clothes.
Yeah.
Wasn't in like during the Exodus, whenever Moses would go up to commune with God, he would come down veiled on his face because his face would be radiant from the presence.
Yeah, it's kind of interesting that in the Old Testament it talks about his face was covered because of the glow. But then Paul talks about the fact that he covers it because the glow was fading. It's kind of an interesting dichotomy there. Imagine being around such a brightness, though, that you weren't burnt or tanned, that you just glowed from that.
Well, Sodom and Gomorrah glowed, but
That's a very different kind of glow. Oh my goodness.
And then in the book of Revelations, chapter 1, it describes his head and his hair were white like wool, as white as snow. His eyes were a flame of fire. Of course, they didn't talk about the eyes in what we're reading, but that's another example of trying to find words to describe this white.
yeah, that compares to Daniel 7 again.
Yeah.
Thrones were set in place. The Ancient of Days took his seat. His clothing was white as snow, and the hair of his head was like pure wool. His throne was flaming with fire, and its wheels were all ablaze. So,
But it's interesting you bring that up, Paula, and thanks for tying that back together, because we just see this Daniel connection so strongly through this section of Mark, and whether it's that or Isaiah 6, if you look at a lot of the passages in Revelation, you've got ancient people using the inadequacy of their language to try to explain something that we can't understand. And I think it's neat, though, that the Lord imbues the writers with the ability to do that in such a way that we 20 centuries later or 30 centuries later can grab onto it. I don't know. I've just always been amazed by that the Lord gave them phrases and phraseology that we can still understand. I know that's not always applicable across all cultures, but we still can kind of grab onto it. So, what was wrong with what Peter said? What was wrong with what Peter said about building the tabernacles? Are you saying that he wasn't wrong?
I am. I am.
Okay, well then, all right, then I'll let you answer it in your own way. Why? Because inherent in this is, why did he come up with this idea? What was the idea?
So, what the scripture says is not that Peter didn't understand what was going on. What the scriptures say is Peter didn't know what to say. Now, what that potentially suggests is James and John just shed it up. Peter felt he needed to say something, and I've been on board with this ideal for a lot of years. Is that Peter was actually leaning into his background training and putting together as best as he could Sukkoth, the Feast of Tabernacles, and the Feast of Booths, because he understood that the practice was a throwback to the wilderness experience. However, it was until God came to tabernacle with men. And when he observed this, that is what came out of his mouth, because he needed to say something, and it may not have been exactly the right or the best thing, except that was the closest he could approximate to why this was happening right now. And for me, I think as best as Peter could, aside from him saying that you're the Christ, you're the Son of the living God, I thought this was pretty erudite for him to fathom while this is going on, because James and John couldn't say anything.
Yeah, I like where you're heading on that, because I mean, there is if you think about 2 Peter 1:16 through 18 being Peter's nod to this, it's not a stretch to think that John 1:14 is not a nod to this too.
Correct.
Right?
Right.
Yeah. Yeah. So I know where you're heading on that.
Yeah.
Okay.
Building on that, I had the same thought, except that I think he was more purposeful. It's not just he didn't know what to say. I think he may not have known what the right thing was to say in actual relation to the truth of what he was seeing, but he knew something to say.
Oh, yeah.
Right. And consider what we were talking about earlier, that, their hopes and dreams of messianic glory had just been shot to pieces. And then given this little tidbit of hope, now 6 days later, man, this looks like hope. This looks like it's actually happening now. He remembers what Daniel said. Like, that was a pretty fresh piece of text for them, historically speaking.
Yep.
They all were looking for every single one of these signs. And he says, oh, that's Daniel chapter 7. I recognize this story. I remember this part. It's happening now. We're not waiting for that dying and being handed over by the authorities and resurrecting. And I don't know what that was, but it's going on now. I'm here. And okay, so what happens every time, like Preston said, what happens when God comes to live with us? We live in booths. We live in tabernacles. God lives in a tabernacle, just like in the wilderness with Moses, just like John says. God was made flesh and tabernacled with us. It even pops up again in Revelation, chapter 21,
Right.
where the people, every nation, tribe, and tongue, will live in tabernacles. So he thought this is the completely appropriate thing. Now's the time, and this is the place. Let's go ahead and start. And he had to be reeled back a little bit. Once again, I know, surprising with Peter, but
Imagine that. All right,
When that question that you wrote, that you were looking for an answer. What is wrong with Peter's suggestion? I think that Peter, we'd all have to say he was very impulsive, and he would insert foot in mouth a lot because he would just blurt out something. And I think that Peter, he really wanted to contain the divine appointment or that a divine moment that was happening, and that's why he wanted to prolong it by building structures and just keeping it there.
Yeah, that's a suggestion that I've heard and read, Paula, was this idea that it's almost as if Peter was like, okay, we're here, we got it, and so we need to package this and hang on to it for as long as we can. And there's a sense that wait a minute, there's this whole other passion narrative that's got to happen before we get there. And so he is to a certain extent selling Jesus short on where that glory goes. And so, yeah, that to me is one of the objections I have to Peter's comment. So I'm agreeing with you on that. I got one other one, but I'll see if anybody has any commentary on that first before I flow.
Well, I'd say his heart's in the right place. You know, he recognized what he was seeing.
Yep.
Kind of had an appropriate response to
Yep.
what he did understand.
Correct.
He just didn't understand the larger framework of why he was seeing it.
Well, you bring up a really interesting point there, Trent. I think it's something that we don't tend to apply much. And we may have talked about this earlier in the study. I just don't recall at this moment. But this idea of progressive revelation, right? And I mean, you see it on a really, no, I'm talking on a macro level. We see it across the Word of God. But even within the disciples, there was an increasing revelation of who Jesus was in their lives, right? Agreed?
Yes, and you're not wrong there, Pastor, but the problem with that is when you've got prophets predicting the future that Yahweh had given them, that was almost progressive revelation there because they didn't see it clearly and they said it and shared it as best as they could, but it revealed itself in a way that was probably different than exactly what they said. So yes, I can get on board with that, but I think that that's unfortunately a frailty that's going to happen because we're stuck in these tents.
Yeah.
Indeed. We're stuck with what we know, what we understand. And in our time, we're captives of our generation, our technology, all of that sort of thing. Our language. Yes. Absolutely. We will see clearly one day, though. We're promised that. So, there's been another objection to Peter saying this the way that he did, and I'm going to tell you why I think he was wrong. Okay, I think you're right. He had his heart in the right place, but why I think that Peter had it misplaced was because right after this, there's not even a beat, and the voice from the cloud says, "Listen to him." And so I sensed that to me, that looks like a response to Peter. Okay, that's where I live with this thing. I may not be right, but that's where I live with this. As Peter says this, and then boom, this is my son. Listen to him. Okay, and listen to him. We're going to have to talk about because there's some you got to unpack that a little bit too. But there's been an objection to. And I kind of get on board with this for two reasons. Now, you'll notice that Peter calls him rabbi. And I forget which and the other. One of them calls him, Matthew calls him master, and Luke calls him Lord, I think. I don't have them right in front of me right now, but one calls him Lord and one calls him master. Peter calls him rabbi. And lots of times people say, well, it makes sense that Peter, that Mark's would have been the right one because it's like the least, and you probably would have cheated up instead of down, but I don't know. Who knows about that? But he calls him rabbi, and then he says, let's build a tent for all three of you guys. And there's this sense that he hasn't quite grasped the fact that Jesus is of a different class than these other two guys. That they were pointing to him, but he's above them. And certainly you can't think that maybe in Peter's mind he's going, we're going to give you a nice big tabernacle, and these two guys can get a little dinky tabernacle. He says, let's build three for you guys. And so there's a sense that and it's been stated quite a bit over the years, that Peter was not quite seeing the uniqueness and specialness of Jesus at this point, and was elevating these other two guys to be equal with him in some ways. So we can't know his mind, and it doesn't explain that. But because right behind this, you get this voice that says, this is my son, listen to him, that Peter was off in the weeds a bit when it came to his identity. Thoughts on that?
Well, I think the clouds are part of the Daniel 7 imagery. It's part of recognizing the situation, just as identifying features, both for those three and for us reading.
Yep.
This is my son, whom I love, listen to him, is part of the trio of
Yes.
voice of
Yes.
God affirmations
Yes.
of Jesus.
Yes. Yes. Yes.
The
Yes.
baptism.
Yes.
This one here.
Yep.
The third one is usually pointed to in Psalm 2 as a still future. This is when all of the kingdoms are finally handed to him with his scepter of iron and all that.
Chad, I will pause you.
Mhm.
So I got Preston going, yes, yes, yes. And so
Yeah.
half of what you said, I couldn't understand. So Preston, thank you for being affirmative. But go back and restate that again so I can hear what you said.
Okay, so it's the clouds were just part of the situation from Daniel as an identifying feature.
Got that?
Voice of God is part of a trilogy, a trio, a triplet of divine enunciations or affirmations of Jesus. First at his baptism. This one is second historically, and then the third one is usually pointed to Psalm 2 as a yet prophetic or yet eschatological event when the nations finally are delivered at his feet and he rules them with a rod of iron and all that.
Under his feet, yeah.
Right, everything that Psalm 2 talks about. So that is going to be yet another, this is my son with whom I'm well pleased utterance, announcement that we can still look forward to. But considering the three of them together, one is the son whom I love at his baptism, just identifies him. This one, listen to him. He's talking to you right now. The last one, in whom I'm well pleased, like he's done, like the work is accomplished. So there's a progress of identification, accreditation, I guess you could say, and then coronation, certification. Sure.
Okay, we'll go with it.
Yeah. Since we need to use big words.
Absolutely. So your point to that is regardless of what Peter was saying or anybody else had blabbered about, this was coming, and it just happened to be the next thing that happened
because God does things in His time, and Peter does things in His time, and
he sure does.
God is no respecter of persons.
Yeah, definitely for sure. All right, I can get on board with that. I'm still going to stay with my opinion, but I can get on board with that.
So can we heap a couple more onto Trent's big, huge station wagon?
All right.
Because I like his triad of listen to my son, because I think that there's a couple of more. And the couple of more, one happens, well, actually, I'll leave that one. One of the key ones is one that Jesus himself says in Luke 6:46. And paraphrased, it's Jesus responding to the group of people saying, how can you call yourselves my disciples if you do not do what I tell you? If you don't do what I say, how are you my disciples? And then if you take a look in all of the Gospels, paraphrased, before you get to Acts 1:8, it says that you're going to go and be my witnesses and you're going to teach folks to do what I command. So I'm with Trent in that this statement about listen to him was going to be presented anyway, and it's not an indictment of Peter because he blurbs out what he says just because he feels like he has to say something.
All right, so if that's the case, then the next question is, what does he mean about it? What does the voice mean when he says listen to him?
Mm-hmm.
What's he telling us? What's he telling them?
I think it's Luke 6:46. It's you can't say it almost is now if we want to talk about indictments, that's an indictment on our culture and our current society. If you say that you're a disciple of Jesus, do what he says. Because we talked earlier, you made allusion or reference to the fact that maybe Peter didn't see Jesus as elevated beyond those two dudes. By the way, which is always a fun question, how did they know who those two dudes were? They didn't have pictures, right? Didn't have magazine. So
Hi,
if
I'm Moses. Hi, I'm Elijah. You know, right?
Sure,
Or Jesus
that could
goes,
happen.
you might remember these gentlemen from history, Moses and Elijah. We just don't have the introductory.
Yeah, I agree. Something like that occurred. So they knew who Jesus was, in whose presence they were when Jesus was transfigured.
I always wanted to know what they were talking about.
Well, look, he also gives the directive: don't tell anybody about this until I resurrect.
Well, yeah, which kind of gets into some of the stuff that John goes through in Revelation, right? It's like,
Correct.
what did you tell him? Now, I think in Matthew or Luke, though, it says they were talking about does say something. Go ahead, Preston.
So I'm simply saying that it's a reminder, at least on the three occasions that certainly Trent references, but then again in Luke 6:46, where Jesus directly confronts and borrows what it is that the Holy Spirit is saying or what Yahweh is saying aloud, that if you are my disciples, do what I say. That's the measurement. Do what I say. Do what he says, listen to him. And then Jesus is saying, not only listen, but do.
Well, I thought you might even go to, the Last Supper where he says, if you love me, you'll keep my commandments. I mean, there's
Sure.
that too. There's a fair number of those sorts of things in the gospel accounts.
Yeah, and the reason I didn't go there, Pastor, is because when I took a look at the Senate hearing this week, Congress hearing, and the guy gets up and he's going to address Congress and says, this is what Jesus' statements about homosexuality were. And then he's quiet for 30 seconds or 60 seconds. Is folks sometimes don't recognize the remez or the quality of Jesus quoting from the Old Testament to say that he endorses it all. So they don't recognize that Jesus's commandments are the same as Yahweh's commandments because they don't necessarily equate them as the one.
Yeah, they don't equate him as being God. They don't equate
Correct.
the idea. And you're right. All he's got to say is they were, God made them man and woman, and that takes it all the way back.
Exactly. Exactly.
By the way, Luke says, the two men talked with him who were Moses and Elijah, who appeared in glory and spoke of his decease, which he was about to accomplish at Jerusalem. So they were talking about his crucifixion. So I thought I remembered seeing that in Luke. I just hadn't looked at it recently. So, yeah, Preston, I didn't read the article that you had put out, but I heard about that, Here's what Jesus said about it, and then he was just quiet. It's like you can't divorce Jesus from the rest of the teaching of the Bible. You just can't, because he's God. But they don't understand that.
Correct.
Well, not on that part, but with the what's the point of these statements out of the clouds? With the framework I was putting out, that it's part of this triad from God.
Yeah.
Acknowledging Jesus. I think the terminology that gets used is important. So at the baptism, it's this is my son with whom I'm well pleased. It's an identification. He hadn't done anything yet, right? Like his priesthood, his ministry began then in accordance with the tradition of Jewish priesthood around 30 years of age. Now he's mid ministry and in fact has just made the turn from the kingdom is coming. I'm here to establish it. I'm the Messiah. He's actually openly identified himself, particularly to his own disciples. And in the next breath, basically says, but all that kingdom stuff is out the window for now. Now I'm going to go to Jerusalem and I'm going to get handed over. I'm going to be betrayed and rejected and I'm going to get killed and then I'm going to be resurrected. And they're like, what are you talking about? But everything he starts talking about from now on is not when the kingdom is here, you guys are all going to walk on in and then these other people will walk in too. So we'll think about the Gentiles while we're at it. Now he starts telling people directly, if you want to enter the kingdom, do this. If you want to enter the kingdom, go sell everything you have. If you want to enter the kingdom, whatever, right? It becomes personal to the people that he encounters, or at least the ones that are recorded. But it's also mission oriented to the cross, rather than to the messianic promise of the kingdom that the disciples expected. Right? So now he starts talking about what his commandments are, talking about a way of life because he knows, and he's trying to start hinting at, there's going to be a body of Christ built. There's going to be this thing that you didn't know about before. This is the new project, and it's part of the overall messianic plan. It's part of establishing the kingdom. But this has to happen, and you have to be an effective body of Christ as part of this plan. So there are commandments coming. It's important for God to say, listen to what those commandments are. This is different from, okay, he's here, you're good now. It's, okay, you need to listen to him because this is important, what you're about to start hearing. Then when I pointed out Psalm 2, the quote is, and this is meant to be, from our perspective, if we take it eschatologically, this is future. This is second coming type of stuff. I have installed my king on Zion upon my holy mountain. I will proclaim the decree spoken to me by the Lord. You are my son. Today I have become your father. Ask me, and I will make the nations your inheritance, the ends of the earth your possession. You will break them with an iron scepter. You'll shatter them like pottery. Which again, I think points at Daniel 7, among other places, where the son, one like the Son of Man, goes to visit the Ancient of Days and is given the kingdoms, every nation, tribe, and tongue. This is a progression. That's the event that the disciples were looking for. This is the messianic fulfillment. But I think it's important to see, hey, we've got this one, listen to him, because the commandments are an important step in the process that they weren't expecting before. And now it's being announced, it's being heralded by the Father himself as one of the steps in the progression of the fulfillment of messianic prophecy.
That's really good. That's really good. You know, it's interesting. You don't quite see it in Mark as much as you do Luke 9, where you see the transfiguration. And by the end of that chapter, and I just preached on this not long ago, by the end of that chapter, he's talking about follow me, follow me, follow me. And if you're not, anyone putting his hand to the plow and turning away is not worthy of the kingdom of God. He's there's a sense of immediacy there. We're getting close. There's no time to be messing around with this whole thing. So yeah, I'm riding with you pretty close on that as to where you're going with that.
Yeah. As for why Moses and Elijah, it's important that he talks a lot about not coming to abolish the law, but to fulfill it.
Right.
It's not purely symbolic, but there's a meaningful presence of Moses, the one by whom the law was given, handing off the baton. the law is now fulfilled in him. Elijah, especially, I think he wrote it down, the Malachi chapter 4, talked about Elijah has to come first, and that's why they kept pointing at John the Baptist. The Matthew's version of the Transfiguration ends with identifying, yes, Elijah did have to come, but he has already come. And Matthew says, oh, by the way, he meant John the Baptist, which Mark and Luke don't say, but it's...
Slow down. We're going to get there in a minute. We'll get there. We'll get there.
Yeah. But that's why it's important for those three to be together.
Yeah, I think it's important. I was just sitting here looking back. This Bible I tend to use on Wednesday nights has a nice harmony of the gospel right in the middle of it. I always like to go back and look at that. I love having a harmony of the gospels close by, because not only do I kind of track things, but it also gives you the timeline, right, of where we are. So you're looking at the fact that this probably occurred in the fall of AD 29, and so we're talking the fall, and next spring he's going to be crucified. So it really cements what you're talking about there, Trent. And when you think of, because I think we kind of lose track of the chronology sometimes, and where he is, and there's the movement and the mission, and then there's the timeline within that mission. And to the point you were making earlier, it's like he's made it all through this. And even though we're only halfway through the book, we're about 2/3 or more of the way through his earthly ministry. And so there's been all this buildup, and now it's really winding down very quickly. I mean, this next 6 months is going to go by like that, and there's a lot of information that needs to be disseminated in a fairly short period of time, and setting these guys up. So I like the way you kind of hit on that. I think there's another teaching here, as well as this idea of the kingdom and the obedience, and that is that we're going to see Jesus predict his death twice more. He's going to continue to do this, and we've been hitting on this already tonight. This scrambles the whole messianic expectation, right? With him saying, I'm going to die. And we'll certainly see it as you kind of start intimate into the latter part of this passage with Elijah, is that they weren't quite getting this. How does this all fit together? And to me, I think part of it is, as the voice was saying, listen to him, was also saying you need to start getting on board with this death, burial, and resurrection thing he's talking about, because it's going to happen. It's going to happen, and you need to get there. They really wouldn't, though, would they? All the way to the very end. Other thoughts? Or I'm moving on.
Well, I was just thinking that the question was, what does the voice in the cloud mean about listening to Jesus?
Yeah.
My thought was that it was a stamp of approval from God that what he's saying is important. And it's just like in Jesus, when he would speak in the Gospels, when something was really important, he would say, verily, verily, I say unto you. It's like, get this point. And I think that was the emphasis of the voice in the cloud.
So yeah, you're definitely in a similar camp with Trent about all of that. Let me read this to you guys, because I think it's important. We tend not to, maybe some of you do, but I don't think that we tend to focus enough on Jesus's prophetic ministry. We hear it. It's there. It certainly shows itself obviously at times, like in the Olivet Discourse. That's That's some pretty serious prophecy that's coming on there. But if you really want to be just straight up about it, him talking about his death and resurrection, that's prophetic. Because he wasn't, he was part of the arc of God's plan. And so he's speaking that to them. This is going to happen. And it's just so I kind of entered this into testimony for tonight, is Deuteronomy chapter 18. Because we're talking about Moses. And we need to know what Moses said. Deuteronomy 18:15, it says, "The Lord your God will raise up for you a prophet like me from your midst, from your brethren, him you shall hear, according to all you desired of the Lord your God in Horeb in the day of the assembly, saying, let me not hear again the voice of the Lord my God, nor let me see this great fire any more, lest I die. And the Lord said to me, what they have spoken is good, and I will raise up for them a prophet like you from among their brethren, and will put my words in his mouth, and he shall speak to them all that I command him. And it shall be that whoever will not hear my words, which he speaks in my name, I will require it of him." And so there's an echo when he says, this is my son, hear him, listen to him. It points all the way back as well. If we're doing Old Testament prophecy, it points all the way back to Deuteronomy chapter 18 as well. And as Preston talks about Remez, and some of you guys may not. Preston, can you give us a 30-second blurb on what Remez is? Because you said it, and I'm going to say it, and everybody may not be aware of the concept and what it means.
It's the art form of that demonstrates the literacy of the first century Jew, that they were so familiar with their Old Testament that they could recite it. They had it head and in their hearts, and Jesus could quote a short part of the verse, and they could quote the rest of the paragraph. So it's not a matter that when Jesus says, for instance, my God, why hast thou forsaken me, that he's talking about Yahweh turning away from him because he can't bear his countenance on the cross. He's referencing back to Psalm 22. And that happens a great deal through Jesus' ministry, where he quotes a piece of scripture, and then not only does that let us know, the listeners know how to fill in the rest, but that he endorses that particular book of the Bible as valid.
Yeah, I particularly like the way you said that last piece, because he's endorsing the scripture. He's putting his stamp on it. You know, there's another aspect to that too, as well as what Jesus says and how it's reported in scripture. But there's so much, both in the Gospels and in the epistles, where they'll just use a phrase, and it doesn't quote the scripture. But anybody reading that with a Jewish background would go, "Oh, okay, yep, I'm with it," and you see that as well. So yeah, it was a well-used vehicle back in the first century for sure. And so, as the voice in the cloud says, you know, listen to him or hear him. There have been many that have said, you know, these guys standing there with Moses in their presence would go, okay, all right, we got the prophet here too. Just adding to the panorama of who Jesus is. Thought that was cool. Any other thoughts on that before I go on to the last part?
Yeah. Well, to the point of identifying him as a prophet, we like to talk about prophets as telling the future, or foretelling, but there's also a possibly larger role of forthtelling.
Right on.
Which, you know, most of the Old Testament prophets didn't really know they were talking about the future, or at least not that there was a specific destination. They were just saying what needed to be said.
Yeah.
Thus says the Lord, with the intent that it applied to the people they were talking to or writing to at the time. And putting Jesus in that vein means don't just listen to the cool future stuff. even if it's important, even though it's important, listen to all of it. Not just all of it, but all of it.
Well, that kind of speaks to the idea that they were staggered because he spoke what? With authority.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
With authority. Yep. Well said. All, listen to all of it. All right, so we have this event on this high mountain. And Mark continues in verse 9. Now, as they came down from the mountain, Jesus commanded them that they should tell no one the things they had seen till the Son of Man had risen from the dead. Let me pause there. It's been noted that every other time he told somebody not to say anything, he just said, don't tell anybody. This is the one time where you see him say, don't tell anybody until this event occurs, right? It's very unique in that way. So they kept this word to themselves, questioning what the rising from the dead meant. And they asked him, saying, why did the scribes say that Elijah must come first? Then he answered and told them, indeed, Elijah is coming first and restores all things. And how is it written concerning the Son of Man that he must suffer many things and be treated with contempt? But I say to you that Elijah has also come, and they did to him whatever they wished, as it is written of him. All right, I hope we can do this justice. So, first off, he tells them to stay quiet. There's been conjecture about that as well. We can talk about that if we have time, what that point was. You had mentioned before that I had in the notes here, Malachi 4, 5 and 6, which is where it talks about Elijah coming. I guess we should probably look at that. Let's sneak over there and take a look at that real quick. So, last book of the Old Testament, there's going to be a 400-year silence. This is the very end of the book. I mean, this is basically the last word in the Old Testament. It says, behold, I will send you Elijah the prophet before the coming of the great and dreadful day of the Lord, and he will turn the hearts of the fathers to the children, and the hearts of the children to their fathers, lest I come and strike the earth with a curse. So, boom, that's it. That's the end of the Old Testament, or the end of the Bible as far as the Jewish people were concerned. So, Jesus, though, makes it clear in verse 13 that Elijah already has come. And he says, and they did to him whatever they wished, as it is written of him. And it's kind of enigmatic in some ways. It's pretty universally agreed upon that he's talking about John the Baptist, right? So we've talked about him before. Now he's that forerunner. But the question has been asked, well, where did Scripture talk about him being mistreated? And the best triangulation that we can get, which totally makes sense if you look at the personalities involved, goes back to 1 Kings 19, where Ahab and Jezebel are looking to destroy Elijah, right? You've got Ahab and Jezebel versus Herod and Herodias, and it seems like there's some personality parallels there with the kind of whacked out husband and the conniving wife and all that went on with that, right? I mean, you can kind of see the personalities lining up. And so I put in the notes here that they're a type of Herod and Herodias. You can see it there. And then Jesus's statements about the Son of Man suffering really does look back at Isaiah 52:13 and following. So it's interesting though that, well, I'm gonna hang on to this. I'll hang on to this statement until we get to this last question, and we'll kind of go back, we're up from the bottom up on this passage a little bit. But so before we get to the Elijah part, we've got this little quick exchange where he tells them to keep quiet. And then and it says, so they kept this word to themselves, questioning what the rising from the dead meant. I don't think they had a problem with the concept. So why was this idea so difficult for the three of them or the 12? What was the issue for them with this rising from the dead?
Well, they really hadn't accepted that Jesus, the Son of Man, was going to suffer and die. So I think they're having trouble because they're not really seeing what's coming.
Okay, so they're having an issue with the personal narrative that Jesus has started to share with them, is what you're saying.
Yep. Uh-huh. And that it's a new teaching, and they just can't quite wrap their heads around it.
Their theology didn't have any concept of a dying Messiah.
Their theology?
Hmm?
Okay. I'm struggling with the word theology there. I'm not sure it's. I think you're right. They didn't have a concept of it, but I think it was more about their ambition, possibly.
Mm.
Right?
Yeah.
I mean, but you know what, Larry? It's an interesting word you use, because how often in our world today does our ambition and our expectation drive our theology instead of the other way around?
Yep.
Yeah. I mean, it's not the worst word to use, and not even necessarily because of their ambition, but their ambition was generated by what they believed out of the scriptures. There's a reason that he has to go on and immediately explain about the suffering servant, like you pointed out in Isaiah 52:53. He has to bring that in and say that this is part of it too. You have to remember this part; it's part of that story, because they didn't. Nothing in Jewish systematic theology made that connection. They thought, oh, well, okay, whatever great warrior, maybe it's Judas Maccabeus is going to get, lay it all out in the line, and he might get killed in the line of duty, or okay, cool. Sounds great when they were thinking about the passage in Isaiah, but not necessarily in terms of David being restored to his throne.
Yep. I know where you're heading on that. Well, we talked about this a few weeks ago, even to the point that they couldn't decide where to capitalize servant, could they? In Isaiah, because they often would see, and we have it in our English Bible, so it helps us discern it better. But they had a challenge sometimes with who that servant was, so they could definitely cloud their view of that.
So, Pastor, when I think about what Larry said, I don't know that I was immediately agreeing with Larry, but now thinking about it with a couple of the comments that you've made and what Trent shared, I think theology is probably a little more appropriate, and here's why. The first century Jew knew Isaiah 52, Isaiah 53, knew it, right? And probably embraced it differently, anticipating Messiah. But today, I can tell you, when I think about Larry's comments, it's almost skipped over today. In fact, if you talk to Messianic Jews, they will tell you that Isaiah 53 is one of the components that they use to help Jewish people accept Jesus as Messiah, because they know it's there, but they don't apply it, because they don't want to think about their theology having been fulfilled in the person of Jesus. So and then when we hearken back and we take a look at Peter, we take a look at James, we take a look at John, and Trent mentioned this earlier. These guys anticipating that the Messiah was going to die, they didn't like necessarily ascribing Isaiah 53 to this person, especially now realizing this kingdom visage, this kingdom actualization that they were a part of. So I think they had a hard time adopting that theological perspective. And let me throw a couple of other oddities into the mix. their history, when we visit them, only has maybe 2 instances of resurrection and one that's scripturally oriented. So the scripturally oriented one is going to be David referring to his deceased son through Bathsheba that he's going to know and see again. But then the only instances of the resurrection that we have that are scripturally captured are the widow's son by the creek with Ahab, and then the Shunammite's son, I think, with Elisha. So the concept.
Somebody, we're getting feedback on somebody's phone. I think.
So the concept of resurrection was a tough one to get their head around, especially given the contrasting position between the Pharisees and the Sadducees.
Oh, you had to bring those two up, didn't you?
Mm-hmm.
Right. I mean, the Sadducees. I brought this up a few weeks ago. It's almost like the Sadducees didn't exist in the Gospels.
Yeah.
You just don't read much about them. They're not there. The reason they're not there is because resurrection is not. It's almost like it's not stirred the hornet's nest. When you get to the book of Acts, the Sadducees are all over it. Now, there's a discussion about maybe the shift in power between the Pharisees and the Sadducees, but and I'm not going to discount that. But I think the reason we see the Sadducees so much more in the book of Acts is because now they're talking Jesus is resurrected. Jesus is resurrected, and they didn't believe in the resurrection, and so they were getting regularly teed off because they were having to confront this resurrected Messiah. And they didn't dig it. So it's interesting you bring that up in the midst of all of that other, because it was kind of nakedly evident that, right, their theology definitely didn't allow for that. Yikes. All right, Larry, we're putting theology back in, bro.
Mm-hmm.
Challenging thought. If we'd been in the same boat, we probably would have missed it too.
Mm-hmm.
We'd been at that time and place. Other thoughts on that? Why they're having such a hard time?
Yeah, an interesting question that you make reference to, Pastor, but you don't really ask.
Okay.
Why these 3 dudes?
Why these 3 versus the 12?
Yep. Why these 3 dudes?
I don't know.
And see,
You answer.
so you referenced the inner circle.
Yeah.
But let me lob this out there. One of the neat phrases that I enjoy catching when you throw it out is considering the cost.
Count the cost.
Exactly. So as much as Peter doesn't know exactly what to say, as much as probably James and John didn't say nothing, they were humming, they were starstruck, they didn't know what to say. These 3 walked away with an ability to count the cost maybe differently than the other 9. And
Uh-oh. Did we just lose Preston?
Number 2.
You guys still here? Wave your hand if you're
I'm
still here.
here.
All right, Preston's kind of halfway here. We'll see if he comes back. Pause for a moment. We lost Ruth too.
Mm-hmm.
I think so.
Paul, are you still there?
Yes.
Okay. Interesting. Well, while we're waiting for Preston to come back, hopefully he'll come back. He'll watch this part if he misses it. I think of Peter in Peter's definitely probably the most outspoken guy of the disciples. Would you agree with that?
Yeah.
Yep.
Probably the most outspoken guy. And it can't be by accident that you call James and John the sons of thunder. I mean, that's got to have. Trent, you ever read anything about how they got that name?
I haven't read anything specifically. And
I can't think so either, right? But they had the nickname.
I like that episode of The Chosen, but
Okay. You just wonder if, oh, by the way, speaking of The Chosen, I don't know if you guys saw Augie and his wife Audrey were in Texas last week filming the episode with the feeding of the 5,000. So
I
he had
remember
posted a bunch of,
yeah.
he had posted a bunch of stuff on Facebook in his full-on first century Jewish garb and what have you. But they look like they treated them like just kings and queens down there. They had all kinds of cool things, and they got to pose in front of different backgrounds and stuff. That was pretty cool.
Yeah.
But I don't know. You wonder that with a name like the Sons of Thunder, that perhaps they were fairly outspoken, which, to Preston's point, they were pretty quiet on the mountain, or at least they weren't recorded as having saying a whole lot. They were kind of stunned. But one wonders if maybe those three were chosen because they were the most outspoken of the group, or something like that. The most outgoing, most gregarious, the most talkative, whatever.
The most motivated.
Sure seems like it.
I mean, you see those two asking to sit at his right hand and his left.
Yeah, that's pretty motivating.
Yeah.
That's pretty motivating. You know what's the weird part, I guess? I don't know. Because you think he would want that inner circle to be the guys who are going to, really, really push it out there, right, and be leaders in the church. But yet James is the first one to get martyred of the disciples. I mean, he ended early in his life.
Yeah. Well, I think this is where Preston was going. In Preston, we didn't hit it yet, but I think he was going with those are the three that were going to be the biggest leaders at the beginning. James presiding over Jerusalem, Peter ultimately going to Rome, and then John in Ephesus, but with all of his further particular revelation that came. Except for Paul, those three contributed, the most didactic portions of the New Testament.
James died early. That's not the same James.
Isn't it?
Mm-mm. Yeah, James died. We're getting multiple Prestons. All right. We're going to do a little multiplicity action here. James, the son of Zebedee, he died in early, at the hands of Herod. So the James we see in the New Testament, the James, the leader of the church, the James, the writer, was supposedly the brother of Jesus, half brother of Jesus. I guess I should be accurate. But I think that's probably where Preston was heading. If we can get him back.
It was.
About their leadership ability?
Yeah, that, and thanks. I think it sounds like you were continuing it as I joined back in with you, is that James lingers a little while. Peter hangs out maybe closer till about 60 AD. And John hangs around till about the end of the century, end of the age. But legend has it that potentially he was tried and attempted to be killed, but was able to come through that. Hence, eventually Ephesus and Patmos, and then coming back to Ephesus. So those guys, in many ways, needed to be exposed to the Transfiguration, so that after Pentecost, they were ready for what the cost was. And seeing Jesus transfigured only helped to strengthen them, especially after Pentecost.
Yeah.
Yes, indeed. I conjectured that also Peter, James, and John may have been the most outspoken. And Trent said they may have been the most motivated.
We tried not to steal your thunder, so to speak.
Isn't that-
you Bon-Airs dude, look at you.
Oh my.
Uh,
Yeah, just for history's sake, James is recorded as being killed by Herod in Acts 12:2.
See Rhoda.
Yeah, right after that, right? That was one episode's in Acts. I think Peter's at the door.
After they're praying for his release.
Meanwhile, Peter's up there and saying, "Guys, let me in, let me in."
That's his ghost. Is it? No. Hey, look, I think Andrew was pretty outspoken too, because Andrew's the guy who goes and gets Peter.
Yeah.
And we believe that Andrew has some affiliation with Philip and Nathaniel. So Andrew's not a bad. Andrew may be a softer spoken guy than his bigger brother, but he's an influencer too.
Didn't the Greeks come to him too? Didn't the Greeks come to him to try to get access to Jesus? I think that's right.
Yes. Yes.
Yeah, when you got Peter as your brother, right? It's just kind of in the shadow. Huh? So, kind of the final question. I'm about out of time, and probably should have allowed more time for it. But just so we can understand, what is it that Elijah restores? Jesus talks about it. What does he restore? What? Because if that's the picture of John the Baptist, what is restored? Because this kind of ties in, if you will, to Jesus' statement. I told you I was kind of working backward a little bit, because he says, indeed, Elijah is coming first and restores all things. And how is it written concerning the Son of Man that he must suffer many things and be treated with contempt? But I say to you that Elijah has come, and they did to him whatever they wished, as it is written of him. So it seems like there's a tension between the restoration and his suffering.
Well, original Elijah was on a big mission, especially against Ahab and Jezebel, for their bringing foreign gods in and polluting the worship in the temple. And so the second coming of Elijah in John the Baptist again was preaching, repent, for the kingdom is at hand.
Mm-hmm.
And I almost thought to tie this with the picture of Ahab and Jezebel is not just Herod and Herodias, but think about ultimately the marriage between the Sanhedrin generally, the Pharisees particularly, and Roman government power. Rome is often portrayed as Babylon, or the whore of Babylon, if you go all the way. And as much as they were contemptuous of Rome and wanted to throw off the shackles, and the Pharisees thought that they were going to be the leading edge, and the point of the spear, and all the other fun stuff, ultimately, when it came down to it, they were told to repent. They were told to clean out all this stuff. And instead, they ran right into Mama's bosom.
Yes, they did.
Into the arms of their foreign lover when it mattered the most. So Elijah in John the Baptist came again to stop them from doing that. And it wasn't just Herod and Herodias that persecuted and killed John the Baptist. You see it particularly in John. The Pharisees were coming after him, even
big time.
His baptism, and never were really in his camp or in his list of followers.
Yeah, he had less than kind things to say about them as well when they came out to the wilderness to check him out.
Yeah, snakes and brood of vipers, and
Yeah, all that. So interesting taking a macro approach to Ahab and Jezebel and the political intrigue of the day.
right. But I mean, they're pretty parallel situations to what Elijah had.
Yeah,
I mean, it's another reason why it's important that Moses and Elijah appeared, because they kind of bookend the period where God dwelt with the people in the land.
Oh.
Because as very shortly after Elijah went off the scene, was carted away very ceremoniously. That's when the destruction started to occur.
yep, you're right.
Almost right away that the northern kingdom was taken down, and then with some reprieve, the southern kingdom eventually went down too.
Yes, I remember reading something about that. That you well said. Bookends. It's perfect. Perfect.
And Jesus represents God being on earth, dwelling in the land again.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Other thoughts on that?
Yeah, I'm only going to step on this briefly because we're out of time, and I don't like to throw grenades out to have us think about things at all afterwards. But
Oh, never, never.
Trent's got us on the doorstep of when this ultimately plays out. This is in the book of Revelation. I would tell you that there's the mark of the beast is what Trent just talked about, which is the marriage of the Sanhedrin or the rulers of Israel to Rome, the ability to buy, sell. A lot of that's there. We just saw the culmination of the law and the prophets, who are in many ways the two witnesses. But I'm not gonna do that. I'm not gonna do it.
Please don't do that tonight.
I'm not gonna do it. So you don't need the two witnesses showing up, blowing up stuff. It's figurative, but that's a whole different discussion.
Yeah, let's not go there. I've had that conversation with you before, and I walked away frustrated. Just leave that alone. I think the just to kind of put a bow on it for tonight. That tension that excuse me, John the Baptist came to lead the people to repentance and forgiveness. Yet Jesus still had to die on the cross. That it just we couldn't do it for ourselves. And even though Elijah had come, Jesus was still going to have to die on the cross. And that's a tension that's there from the Old Testament view of it, and then looking at who he is. I like the fact that Trent, you were talking about the fact that now it's kind of an all-out run to Calvary from this point on. And it is just this next, even though we're really at lesson 20 and we've got like 39 lessons, I think, in this, you're going to see a great compression of time now to get us to the end of this. And the intensity and the immediacy are going to just build and build through this second half of the study. So strap in, folks. It's going to be an interesting ride. Any final thoughts before we close for tonight?
This is stuff you can challenge yourself and your church-going friends with during the course of the week. Is just taking a look at the mind-blowing experiences of these regular guys that Jesus picked up to change the world. It's a delight to be able to almost unpack them this way. So thanks.
Yeah, I mean, you're not kidding. I mean, the God of the universe came to this planet and picked these guys out and literally gave them the keys to the kingdom. And at this point, 6 months or so from his death, burial, and resurrection, they are just now getting a glimpse of what's going on and blown away. And it is an encouragement for us, right? I mean, we were as kids, we've got a spirit indwelling us, and we're so much better equipped than they were, even as they were there with the Lord. All right, guys, well, let's have a word of prayer, and we'll be dismissed for tonight.